Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. So, massive news out of Charlie Munger and the Daily Journal Corporation this week, and that is that Charlie Munger has put 19% of the Daily Journal Corporation's US portfolio into a new stock. And this is massive news for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we get to see what Charlie Munger is buying, and we can, publicly see what that company is, and then of course look at it ourselves as a potential investment. But secondly, Charlie Munger almost never has a transaction. He has a few stocks in his personal portfolio. Those stocks are Berkshire Hathaway, Costco, and he also has a chunk of Lee Lu's fund, Himalaya Capital. And that's basically it. He never has a transaction, and he always tells people that he's constantly outperforming the market by basically just sitting on his backside and letting those businesses compound. And within the Daily Journal Corporation, which he also manages money for, they, to my knowledge, have not had a transaction since 2009. There's a very famous story of Charlie Munger basically pulling over on the highway in order to call his broker and put a whole bunch of money into three companies, that being Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and US Bancorp. And basically, just by sheer fluke, essentially, timing those three stocks to almost the absolute bottom during the financial crisis. That part of it was a fluke, but he was more than confident that those businesses would perform quite well relative to the price that he was paying. And just this week, in April 2021, this is the first transaction that has happened for the Daily Journal Corporation since that day in 2009. And Charlie Munger has gone ahead and bought e-commerce giant Alibaba. And I want to talk a little bit about that business specifically. Also going to look at a rough estimate of intrinsic value for the company to see what kind of price Charlie Munger was paying. That'll be towards sort of the back end of the video, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll also talk through some other things to do with Munger and the Daily Journal Corporation. I think it's easy to look up their 13F filings and look at the US holdings and try and sort of piece together what's going on with the US portfolio, but there's actually also some other considerations. They also own some overseas stocks, one big one in particular being BYD. So I've gone ahead and done some work on basically putting together the overall Daily Journal Corporation portfolio, what it looked like back in December last year when I actually did a video on the Daily Journal Corporation, and now what it looks like today in April 2021 with a new stock built in and some updated prices for the existing holdings. Now, firstly, let's talk about Charlie Munger's actual investment strategy, and then we can kind of start to see where Alibaba might fit into that strategy. So, Charlie Munger very famously had a big influence on his longtime business partner, Warren Buffett, at Berkshire Hathaway. Now, Warren Buffett had initially been educated by Ben Graham, and he was basically sort of taught to buy very cheap, beaten down companies that were trading well below maybe their liquidation value or the cash that they had on their balance sheet. Basically extremely cheap companies, really balance sheet focused and not necessarily caring about the prospects for the company moving forward, because you could basically just wind it up and distribute all the assets and the cash and so on to the shareholders and make a profit that way. So that was sort of the way that Buffett and even Munger back in the day were investing. But as Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger sort of scaled up and had a lot more money to invest, those opportunities really became a lot more limited, and they were forced to sort of pivot their strategy into more high quality businesses that they can own for a long period of time. And that, of course, led to some very famous investments from Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway in the form of See's Candy, Coca-Cola, American Express, Apple more recently, and countless other businesses that he was able to basically buy and just hold on to for decades in some cases, and have those businesses compound over time and have the intrinsic value of those companies grow as well. And Charlie Munger still has that exact same strategy. That's what he did with the US banks. He bought them and he sat on them, and they've done quite well over the past decade. And he has also done the exact same thing with his Berkshire Hathaway position, his Costco position, which I think he's owned since around 2000. And now I think he probably has similar plans with his Alibaba position in the Daily Journal Corporation's portfolio. Now, Alibaba as a business, of course, is the e-commerce giant in China that was founded by Jack Ma, a very famous entrepreneur worldwide at this point. And Alibaba is operating in several different sort of business segments. So they're actually quite famous for constantly pumping out new subsidiaries. They actually have like several subsidiaries a week, sometimes even get registered, which is kind of crazy to me. But certainly some of their bigger brands are quite well known. So of course we have AliExpress, which you can buy a whole bunch of cheap stuff here. I know I used to get all like my GoPro accessories and things from AliExpress. Still buy the occasional thing over there. Really cheap, not the highest quality goods in the world, but very useful if you're wanting to save a bit of money on things like GoPro accessories and that kind of stuff in my case. So we have AliExpress, we have Alibaba.com, we have Daraz, Alibaba Cloud, Alibaba Pictures, alisports.com, and the list sort of just goes on and on and on and on. It's a very, very long list of subsidiaries that the business has, and it's a massive entity. So back in 2020, the company produced in US dollar terms about 72 billion US dollars. So massive company, and really interesting to see Charlie Munger buy into one of these big companies that is actually still growing really fast. So if you look at their revenue and earnings growth over the past few years, both of those things have grown extremely fast. In some cases, close to about 50% a year over the past few years. So, Charlie Munger is a value investor, but he's willing to buy these higher growth companies because growth is, of course, a pivotal factor in the overall value equation. As Charlie Munger would put it, all intelligent investing is value investing. Let's look at two more things in this video. Firstly, I want to look at the Daily Journal Corporation's overall portfolio as it stands now, including their overseas holdings as far as we can gather, because they haven't actually ever been disclosed in Daily Journal Corporation reports, but there's been some very intelligent people on the internet kind of tracking possible stocks that this could be based on the Daily Journal Corporation's balance sheet movements over time, and also some of the things that Charlie Munger has said, where he has actually explicitly said in some Daily Journal meetings that the company owns some BYD stock and so on. So let's look at the portfolio as it stood back in December when I made a video on the company, and also let's look at the portfolio today in April 2021. So if we go back to December, we basically have 5 stocks in the portfolio. We have Bank of America, Wells Fargo, US Bancorp, POSCO, which is definitely a lesser successful investment for Munger, but he's still just holding on to that, and also BYD shares trading on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And at the time, the big story there was that the price of BYD shares had just exploded in the last 12 months. So that stock specifically at the time made up about 57% of the portfolio, which as a whole was worth around $280 million. If we fast forward through to today, again, we have those 5 stocks still sitting in the portfolio, but we now have a number 6. So the 5 stocks, of course, being Bank of America, Wells Fargo, US Bancorp, POSCO, and BYD still sit in there. I've updated the prices here, which you will see on the screen, because pretty much all of those stocks have gone up with the exception of BYD, which has come down very slightly. But I've also added in the Alibaba position. Now, if you look on a website like Whale Wisdom, for example, you will see that it says Alibaba makes up 19% of the portfolio. That's only considering the US position. So if we include BYD in the mix here, we can see that Alibaba actually only makes up about 10% of the portfolio, but nonetheless still a relatively sizable bet for the overall company. And the portfolio is now worth about $357 million. Part of that is from those initial 5 stocks kind of going up a little bit, and part of it is from the new Alibaba position that's been added to the portfolio. And interestingly, this is actually probably not the first time that Charlie Munger has actually owned Alibaba. Now, it may be surprising for you to hear that, but Munger has actually owned this before indirectly, and that is because he's a big investor in Li Lu's fund, Himalaya Capital, and Li Lu was actually a shareholder in Alibaba at one point. Up until August 2020, Li Lu's fund, Himalaya Capital, actually owned about 175 million shares of Alibaba. Like I say, they were sold in about August 2020, but at the time that was a huge position for the fund. It was worth about $4.3 billion in total, that holding. Assets under management for Himalaya Capital is a little bit tricky to get data on, but most estimates that are floating around are that they have about $13 billion under management. So about 4 of the 13 billion was simply in Alibaba at that time. And of course, Charlie Munger sort of owned some of that indirectly by being an investor in the fund. Okay, so finally for today's video, let's do a quick intrinsic value assessment for Alibaba. Now, I have to preface this by saying that I have not yet done a deep dive on Alibaba, but after seeing some of the numbers that I'm about to present to you, I'm definitely going to do that. So for most of this, I'm really just working off the current business performance and also the current expectations of analysts in terms of future growth. But of course, if you're looking at making an investment in Alibaba yourself, do your own work, do your own research, understand the risks and potential rewards that are within that business, and don't take these numbers as investment advice, of course. But with that said, here's a screenshot of my rough sort of intrinsic value initial assessment for Alibaba. So they're currently working off about a 29% expected growth rate for the next 5 years. That is a large growth rate, so of course do your research and make sure you're confident they can achieve that. I've scaled that down, this is just my own estimate, to 15% for the next 5 years in this discounted cash flow. And the other stats for the business is that last year they produced about 24 billion in free cash flow, and they had net cash of close to $48 billion. So if we run all those numbers and we convert that to a per share basis as well, with about 2.7 billion shares outstanding, this is what we get. So we get a present value of future cash flows of about 1.1 trillion US dollars. They've got a little bit of cash, so that pushes us up to $1.2 trillion in market cap terms. And that gives us an intrinsic value per share of about 440 US dollars. Now, if we want a margin of safety, let's just jump straight to the big 50% margin of safety. We would have to buy at about 220 US dollars, and the current price for Alibaba is about 230 US dollars. So if all of those assumptions happen to be correct, that makes Alibaba look really cheap today. So Charlie Munger certainly loves to buy a great business, but he certainly does not like to overpay for it. In his own words, no business is worth an infinite price, and we must get a margin of safety given the natural vicissitudes of life. That is a quote from Charlie Munger. So those are my thoughts on the initial sort of intrinsic value for Alibaba and a bit of the background on the Daily Journal Corporation and Munger's investment strategy and the Lilu connection and so on. So really interesting one for me to see this news this week, and this is definitely going to cause me to do a deep dive on Alibaba coming up very soon to see if I can figure out what Charlie Munger was kind of seeing here. So that's it for me today. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit like and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.